last week personally with her and George Lakoff, who's an expert on cognitive linguistics and framing, and we had a discussion about how to change the narrative. And I asked her to write something for us here. I asked her to attend, but she's back in New York. And just right about 30 minutes ago, she wrote this back to me for you guys here. She said, "We are fighting Wall Street, powerful forces, Duncan, Gates, Broad, Walton. They can be defeated by democracy. Need the public to know, don't let the 1% steal our public schools or turn our kids into compliant robots or demoralize and crush our teachers." That's from Diane Ravitch to all of you here, written about half an hour ago. And so we've entered this sort of bizarro world. I'm a vapid champion of the status quo, and I live in a small apartment in Oakland with my wife and small son up here. And we drive a very expensive $10,000 car. And I work at a community college with working class students, and now I'm a champion. And this is from somebody, Frederick Hess, who received $500,000 from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Right? I have no idea what his salary is, but I imagine it afforded him something larger than an apartment in downtown Oakland. Right? How does this happen that I become a champion of the status quo? How does it happen that somebody who is a proxy scholar for billionaires becomes some kind of revolutionary insurgent, right? This is Orwellian, right? How is it that hedge fund managers somehow become those that are going to take over and make our schools better, and that teachers are self-interested but the billionaires are philanthropists? I mean, this is crazy. And yet, this is also widely believed. I think that's what's more frightening, is not only is this message being pumped out there, but people believe it. Well, how has that happened? Some of the previous speakers spoke about this at length. I'll be short on this. Bill Gates has invested about $80 million simply in advocacy, purchasing people like Hess, other scholarship institutes that put out studies that are favorable to free market ideas, such as charter schools and merit pay. There are then bloggers, proxy bloggers, who then report on this. And there's a whole infrastructure of media designed to pump out a simple frame. And a frame is basically a narrative or a story. And I'm an English teacher, so I love stories. And the story is simply this. Schools are broken, number one. The schools are broken. Not our society is broken, but the schools are broken. Who is to blame? Bad teachers are to blame. And they're protected by evil unions. And our savior is the free market. And that story is repeated over and over and over again in many different forms. And you'll hear it in Gates-funded media such as NBC, right? Education Nation is a forum which is devoted to emanating that narrative. Bill Gates is in that show and funds the show. It's your charter schools that he funds as well, right? But what's interesting is this narrative has so much trickle out to other forums as well and becomes the norm. So, for example, I'm listening to NPR the other day, and they have a show about rocket ship charter schools, which are funded by Bill Gates, and how great they are. And at these schools, students spend 2 hours a day on computers, and it saves them overhead on teachers, right? So as one of our earlier speakers said, the debate becomes framed. Not only are teachers framed as being to blame for all the problems in society, but the debate itself is framed. There's a normal, natural story. Anthony Cody, who is a wonderful former Oakland school educator, leader of Save Our Schools movement, he called this the education reform bubble, which has wonderful double meanings, right? Filling in scam bubbles. And also, it connects with the housing bubble, an incredible amount of hype and money. Anyone that dissents from it is castigated. And we saw the devastation wrought by the housing bubble. And Cody argues we're seeing the same thing right now. So Diane Ravitch, who I mentioned at the beginning and previously mentioned as well, wrote The Death and Life of the Great American System. How many people, just raise your hand, have read that book? Okay. And her story is that she was on the other side. She's a whistleblower, right? She told me in emails that she worked at the Manhattan Institute, for example. They worked on to get girls involved with this cause by painting it as a social justice, right? So, for example, education is a civil rights issue of our generation, as if Martin Luther would be walking hand in hand with Bill Gates. Again, we're on the other side of the glass, right? So within this bubble, a public school teacher becomes the reason the country is broke. And billionaires become heroes. And furthermore, critics become the status quo. Ravitch, when she was on that side of promoting the market before she wrote this book, Death and Life of the Great American School, was able to get on any media program she wanted to. She was regularly published in the New York Times, regularly on corporate media. In a series of email conversations with her, she told me as soon as she published this book, her publisher could not get her television program. Okay, so she could not get on a single national television program. Michelle Rhee or any of the other reformers. Education Nation, sponsored by Bill Gates, gave her 30 seconds. They refused to have her on in any substantive way. She had regularly written editorials for the New York Times. As soon as she was refused again and again from having her editorial published. The editor apparently was going to be working for Bloomberg, who she'd written a whole chapter critiquing, and so while the editor was there, she was never able to get an editorial published. Finally, as you know, Ravitch is making inroads. She's on The Daily Show. She's been on media here. She's starting to make a dent. So as soon as this happens, what happened to me is happening to her. Arnie Duncan, who, by the way, recently spoke with Frederick Hess, who insulted me at a conference at the American Enterprise Institute, right? Who used the word productivity 17 times in his speech and the word learning 5 times, which tells you something. He goes on to say, after Ravitch started to get some leverage and started to get her voice out, Diane Ravitch is in denial and she's insulting all the hardworking teachers, principals, and students all across the country who are proving her wrong every day. There's also a series of blogs that come from Gates-funded people that come out to attack her. This is the problem. We've heard the problem at length. The major problem is it's not only a war on education, it's a war of language fundamentally, because I'm an English teacher, that's what I look at. It's a war of language, it's a war of marketing and branding, and let's be honest, we suck at marketing. We're teachers, we like facts, we like evidence, right? That doesn't lend itself very well to the news cycle. And the narrative that the corporate reformers, as I will call them, have constructed is very appealing to people, right? If the schools aren't broken, what is broken? It's a much bigger problem. It's much harder to admit. We have 22% childhood poverty in this country. And it's so much harder for us as a society to admit that's the problem. It's much easier to say, well, if we just fix the schools, then it'll be over. So I think the public also would like to believe that. Does that make sense? And you have to believe that all of these phrases that you hear have been very well engineered in think tanks by people like Frank Luntz, who is the word master who came up with climate change and war on terror. I don't know that he's been involved, but you have to imagine all these phrases you hear, like reform, have been well engineered and are like genetically modified viruses that go out into the language. So I'm seriously, right? And how can you disagree with bad teachers, right? Who wants a bad teacher in their classroom? Anybody here? Who's against saving our schools? Who wants broken schools to be around? They're linguistic traps. Do you guys see that? Does anyone ever feel trapped in arguing with somebody about that? Yes, because the language has been framed. So where do we go from here? I met again last week with Ravitch and with George Lakoff, who I did my master's work on. And Lakoff is a master, again, of how to frame issues and discuss them, what words to use. We're in the process of creating a think tank in order to develop language that better express our point of view, focusing on empathy and creativity, imagination over testing, and finding ways to reframe the debate so we're just not responding to criticisms, but actively pushing our case. So instead of constantly being on the defensive, does anyone feel that? That we're going on the offensive. Because the more we're on the defensive, the more ironically that we reinforce their position. So I'll leave you with this, something you can do tonight that's kind of fun, okay? If you're on Twitter, I I drove my wife nuts. Our baby was crying all night, and I said, let me just do this Twitter just for another minute, okay? So Michelle Rhee, this will be my last comment, and this is a fun game you can play for the day. I'm sorry, it'll ruin the rest of the speakers' presentations. Okay. Michelle Rhee in Students First, which is basically privatization first, I would say, had a game where you could win an iPad too if you write a 6-word essay on what makes a great teacher. Okay? So what we did is we took this and made 6-word essays about Michelle Rhee and about what's happening to our schools. And I'd like just to read you 3 or 4 of them, and then you can look them up on Twitter and things like that. So for example, students first in line for standardized tests. Reagan to air traffic controllers, students first, teachers. Think about that one for a minute. 5-word essay, right? Real teachers everywhere reject Rhee's reforms. Teachers are expensive, let's hire interns. That's about TFA. Reform means one size fits all. Smarter students are politically dangerous. We don't need no stinking libraries. Technically speaking, software can replace teachers, and that's actually done at the rocket ship schools. And there is like hundreds of these now online. And this is an effort to end up reclaim the language. So I think when you're out there advocating, this is the final word I'd leave, is to really think about the language that you're using and really make sure that it expresses your values. And thank you very much for your time.